Okay, guys, that we might be able to finish George's Marvellous Medicine tonight. Marvellous Medicine number 2. They were in the kitchen now, and the big saucepan was on the stove. All the things Mr. Cranky had bought were lined up near the sink. "Come along, my boy," cried Mr. Crilly Cranky. "Which one did you put in first?" "This one," George said. "Golden Gloss Hair Shampoo." He emptied the bottle into the pan. "Now the toothpaste," George went on, "and the shaving soap, and the face cream, and the nail varnish." "Keep at it, my boy," cried Mr. Cranky, dancing around the kitchen. "Keep putting them in. Don't stop. Don't pause. Don't hesitate. It's a pleasure, my dear fellow, to watch you work." One by one, George poured and squeezed the things into the saucepan. With everything so close at hand, the whole job didn't take more than 10 minutes. And when it was done, the saucepan didn't seem to be quite as full as the first time. "Now, what did you do?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Did you stir it?" "I boiled it," George said, "but not for long, and I stirred it as well." So, Mr. Cranky lit the gas under the saucepan, and George stirred the mixture with the same long wooden spoon he had used before. "It's not brown enough," George said. "Wait a minute, I know what I've forgotten." "What?" Mr. Cranky said. "Tell me quick." Because if we've forgotten even one tiny thing, then it won't work. At least not in the same way. "A quart of brown gloss paint," George said. "That's what I've forgotten." Mr. Crilly Cranky shot out of the house and into the car like a rocket. He sped down to the village, bought the paint, rushed back. He opened the can in the kitchen and handed it to George. George poured the paint into the saucepan. "Aha! That's better," George said. "That's more like the right colour." "It's boiling," said Mr. Cranky. "It's boiling and bubbling, George. Is it ready yet?" "It's ready," George said. "Or at least, I hope so." "Right," shouted Mr. Cranky. "Let's test it. Let's give it to us chicken." "My heavens alive, why don't you calm down a bit?" Mrs. Cranky said, coming into the kitchen. "Calm down?" cried Mr. Cranky. "You expect me to calm down? And here we are mixing up the greatest medicine ever discovered in the history of the world. Go on, George. Dip a cupful out of the saucepan, get a spoon, and we'll give some to the chicken just to make sure we've got it absolutely right." Outside in the yard there were several chickens that hadn't had any of George's Marvellous Medicine number 1. They were pecking around in the dirt the way silly chickens do. George crouched down, holding out a spoonful of Marvellous Medicine number 2. "Come on, chicken," he said. "Chick, chick, 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 chick." White chicken with black spots on the feathers looked up at George, walked over the spoon and went back. The effect that medicine number 2 had on this chicken was not quite the same as the effect produced by medicine number 1, but it was very interesting. "Whoosh!" shrieked the chicken, and it shot 6 feet up in the air and came back down again. Then sparks came flying out of its beak, bright yellow sparks of fire, as though someone was sharpening a knife on a grindstone inside its tummy. Then its legs began to grow longer. Its body stayed the same size, but the 2 thin yellow legs got longer and longer and longer and longer still. "What's happening to it?" cried Mr. Crilly Cranky. "Something's wrong," George said. The legs went on growing, and the more they grew, the higher up in the air went the chicken's body. When the legs were about 15 foot long, they stopped growing. The chicken looked perfectly absurd, with its long, long legs and its ordinary little body perched high up on top. It was like a chicken on stilts. "Oh, excuse me." "Oh, my sainted arts!" cried Mr. Crilly Cranky. "We got it wrong. This chicken's no good at anybody. It's all legs. No one wants chicken legs." "I must have left something out," George said. "I know you left something out," cried Mr. Cranky. "Think, boy, think. What was it you left out?" "I've got it," said George. "What was it? Quick!" "Flea powder for dogs," George said. "You mean you put flea powder in the first one?" "Yes, Dad, I did. A whole can of it." "That's the answer." "Wait a minute," said George. "Do we have any brown shoe polish on our list?" "We did not," said Mr. Cranky. "Oh, I used that too," said George. "Well, no wonder it went wrong," said Mr. Cranky. He was already running to his car, and soon he was heading down to the village to buy more flea powder and more shoe polish. Marvellous Medicine number 3. "Here it is!" cried Mr. Crilly Cranky, rushing into the kitchen. One carton of flea powder for dogs and a tin of brown shoe polish. George poured the flea powder into the giant saucepan. Then he scooped the shoe polish out to the tin and added it as well. "Stir it up, George," shouted Mr. Cranky. "Give it another boil. We've got this one. I'll bet we've got it." After medicine number 3 had been boiled and stirred, George took a cupful of it out to the yard. Excuse me. To try on the chicken. Mr. Cranky ran after him, flapping his arms and hopping with excitement. "Come and watch this one," he called to Mrs. Cranky. "Come and watch us turn an ordinary chicken into a lovely great big one that lays eggs as big as footballs." "I hope you do better than last time," said Mrs. Cranky, following them out. "Come on, chicken," said George, holding out a spoonful of Marvellous medicine number 3. "Good chicken, chicken. Have some of this lovely medicine." A magnificent black cockerel with a scarlet comb came stepping over. The cockerel looked at the spoon and went, "Peck!" "Cock-a-doodle-doo!" squawked the cockerel, shooting up into the air and coming back down again. "Oh, watch him now," cried Mr. Cranky. "Watch him grow. Any minute he's going to start getting bigger and bigger." Mr. Cranky, Mrs. Cranky, and little George stood in the yard staring at the black cockerel. The cockerel stood quite still. It looked as though it had a headache. "What's happening to its neck?" Mrs. Cranky said. "It's getting longer," George said. "I'll say it's getting longer," Mr. Cranky said. Mrs. Cranky said. Mr. Cranky, for once, said nothing. "Last time it was the legs," Mrs. Cranky said. "Now it's the neck. What's a chicken with a long neck? You can't eat a chicken's neck." It was an extraordinary sight. The cockerel's body hadn't grown at all, but the neck was now 6 feet long. "All right, George," Mr. Cranky said. "What else have you forgotten?" "I don't know," George said. "Oh, yes, you do," Mr. Cranky said. "Come along, boy. Think. You're probably just one vital thing you've missed and you've got to remember it." "I put in some engine oil from the garage," George said. "Do you have that on your list?" "Eureka!" cried Mr. Cranky. "That's the answer. How much did you put in?" "Half a pint," George said. Mr. Cranky ran to the garage, found another half pint of oil. "And some antifreeze," George said. "I sloshed in a bit of antifreeze." Marvellous medicine number 4. Back in the kitchen once again, George, with Mr. Cranky, watching him anxiously, tipped half a pint of engine oil and some antifreeze into the giant saucepan. "Boil it up again," cried Mr. Cranky. "Boil it up and up." "Boil it and stir it." George boiled it and stirred it. "You'll never get it right," said Mrs. Cranky. "Don't forget you don't just have the same things, but you've got to have exactly the same amounts of those things. How can you possibly do that?" "You keep out of this," cried Mr. Cranky. "We're doing fine. We've got this. We've got it this time. Just you wait and see. Just see if you haven't." This was George's marvellous medicine number 4. And when it was boiled for a couple of minutes, George once again carried a cupful into the yard. Mr. Cranky ran after him. Mrs. Cranky followed more slowly. "You're going to have some mighty queer chickens around here if you go on like this," she said. "Dish it out, George," cried Mr. Cranky. "Give a spoonful to that one over there." He pointed to the brown hen. George knelt down and held out the spoon with the medicine on it. "Chick, chick," he said. "Try some of this." The brown hen walked over and looked at the spoon. Then it went peck. "Whoosh! Ouch!" it said. Then a funny whistling noise came out of his beak. "Watch it grow," shouted Mr. Cranky. "Don't be too sure," said Mrs. Cranky. "Why is it whistling like that?" "Keep quiet, woman," cried Mr. Cranky. "Give it a chance." They stood there staring at the brown hen. "Getting smaller," George said. "Look at it, Dad. It's shrinking." And indeed it was. In less than a minute, the hen had shrunk so much it was no bigger than a newly hatched chick. It looked ridiculous. "Goodbye, Grandma." "There's still something you've left out," Mr. Cranky said. "Oh, I can't think what it could be," George said. "Give it up," Mrs. Cranky said. "Pack it in, you'll never get it right." Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with a spoon in one hand and a cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into view. From her enormous height, she glared down at the three people below her and she shouted, "What's going on around here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's hard enough having to sleep in the yard with the rats and the mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs, no bacon, no buttered toast." "Oh, I'm sorry, Mother," Mrs. Cranky said. "We've been terribly busy. I'll get you some right now." "Let George get it, the lazy little brute!" Grandma shouted. Just then, the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw it was full of brown liquid. Oh, there's Grandma peering down at George. It looked very much like tea. "Ha-ho!" she cried. "Ha-ha! So that's your little game, is it? You make look after yourself all right, don't you? You make quite sure you've got a nice cup of morning tea. But you didn't think to bring one to your poor old Grandma. I always knew you were a selfish pig." "No, Grandma," George said. "This isn't—" "Don't lie to me, boy!" the enormous old hag shouted. "Pass it up here this minute." "No," cried Mrs. Cranky. "No, Mother, don't. That's not for you." "Now you're against me too," shouted Grandma. "My own daughter trying to stop me having breakfast, trying to starve me out." Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman and he smiled sweetly. "Oh, of course it's for you, Grandma," he said. "You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot." "Don't think I won't," Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out to the huge horny cup for the hand. "Hand it over, George." "No, no, Grandma," George cried out, pulling the cup away. "You mustn't. You're not to have it." "Give it to me, boy," yelled Grandma. "Don't," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's George's Marvellous." "Everything's George's around here," shouted Grandma. "George is this, George is that. I'm fed up with it." She snatched the cup out of the little George's hand and carried it high out of reach. "Drink up, Grandma," Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely. "Lovely tea." "No!" the other two cried. "No, no, no!" But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she had swallowed everything that was in it. "Mother!" Well, Mrs. Cranky, "You've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine number 4, and look what it did to this. Look what one tiny spoonful did to the little brown hen." But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. "Oh, now you've done it," cried Mrs. Cranky. "You've cut the old girl's goose." "I didn't do anything," Mr. Cranky said. "Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it." A tremendous hissing sound was coming up from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. "She'll feel better once she's let off a bit of steam," Mr. Cranky said. "She's going to blow up!" Mrs. Cranky wailed. "Her boiler's going to burst!" "Stand clear!" Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt his ears. "Call the fire brigade!" cried Mrs. Cranky. "Call the police! Man the hose pipes!" "Too late," said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. "Grandma!" shrieked Mrs. Cranky. "Mother! Run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water!" But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She had started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. "Watch this, George!" Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. "Watch what happens when someone has 50 spoonfuls instead of one." Very soon Grandma was back to normal height. "Stop!" Mrs. Cranky said. "That's just right." But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half a minute she was no bigger than a bottle full of lemonade. "How do you feel, Mother?" cried Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression that it had always had. Her eyes, no bigger than now the little keyholes, were blazing with anger. "How do I feel?" she yelled. "How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago and now you were a miserable midget?" "She's still going," said Mr. Cranky gleefully. "She's getting smaller." And by jolly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and cried, "How do I stop her getting smaller still?" "You can't," said Mr. Cranky. "She had 50 times the right amount." "I must stop her," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "I can hardly see her as it is." "Catch hold of each end and pull," Mr. Cranky said. By then Grandma was the size of a matchstick and shrinking fast. A moment later she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed. Then... "Where is she?" cried Mrs. Cranky. "I've lost her." "Hooray!" cried Mr. Cranky. "She's gone, she's disappeared completely," said Mrs. Cranky. "That's what happened if you're grumpy and bad-tempered," said Mr. Cranky. "Great medicine of yours, George." George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where'd you get to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly. And by lunchtime she was saying, well, I suppose it's all for the best, really." She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she? "Yes," Mr. Cranky said. "She most certainly was." George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments, he had touch with the very tips of his fingers, the edge of the magic world. The end. I really hope you've enjoyed listening to that. I have loved reading this for you. Take care, guys.